I'm Alex Brown, and this is the second part of CIT 2211, my Studio 2 computer game design course. So the last time you saw this game, the premise was simple. It was just survive for 60 seconds in each room and you win. Now I've added some more challenges into the room to make gameplay more varied. Now in each room, after a certain amount of time, a pickup will be dropped in a random spot in the room. This pickup will need to be collected in order to progress, and you need to collect 4 in each room in order to complete a room. The enemies stop spawning after that and then allow the player to move on. This means that now the player can't just stand in a corner of a room and camp for the time limit. Now it's much more about shooting their way through hordes of enemies instead of just having to evade them round into a corner and shoot them in big groups. I did some playtesting with the new changes and received some good feedback. The main points I received from the feedback were firstly, with the new props and items in the scene, a lot of the space that was there before was removed, and so now it's harder to evade larger groups of enemies. So in order to combat this, I turned down the spawn rates for each of the rooms and also removed the increasing spawn rate every 15 seconds, as with the new gameplay objective in each room, it's now required to move through hordes of enemies, not just evade them. So it was much more difficult with the increasing enemies. Another serious point was that the camera was too far away from the player. This was causing problems as the UMG was already quite small. My players were so far from the actual player because the camera was so far away, they had to focus all their attention on one tiny part of the screen, meaning they were unable to read HUD information, and basically in a 1920 by 1080 resolution screen they were looking at about 7 pixels. Some of the feedback I got from my art style was that players really liked the voice acting and the gun sounds. However, the gun sounds were very kind of monotonous, and it'd be better if there was variance. So I added a random float modifier to the pitch, so each time a sound is played, it's slightly different. I was also told to reduce the intensity of my pickup drop lights, as the post-process effects has caused them to bloom a lot more than expected. I also got some information on some bugs I had to squash, things like pickups not dropping at the appropriate time, breaking the game, enemies falling through small gaps in meshes, some lighting problems, all stuff that was easily fixed and dealt with. Another interesting design point I took on was based on my colour theory. Early on I had lots of blues in my scene. Obviously I wanted to go for a blue aesthetic, kind of blue steel. But I also had some reds in my scene, and I was advised to go with more yellows because they're complementary colours and it fits better with my scene. The feedback I received from a technical standpoint last time was that my blueprints were good. My problems, however, were mainly based around inefficiency, fast and easier way to do things, and using the level blueprint for too much work. This semester I've addressed those problems first. Firstly, I removed a large portion of the work on the level blueprint and moved it into its own personal blueprint. This included all of the spawning for the different rooms. Now instead of running off the level blueprint, everything about spawning enemies is separate. One of the major issues was the weapon system. Each weapon available to the player was an individual blueprint with its own communication methods and their own firing logic. This was manageable at first when I only had 1 or 2 weapons, but when more weapons were introduced, the logic for swapping weapons out correctly without bugs was largely confusing, causing problems like players having 2 guns at once or no gun at all. This is due to the fact that the blueprint was detaching and reattaching weapons every time the player changed, and if more than 2 weapons were picked up in a short amount of time, it bugged out. In order to fix this, I took all of the firing logic for the weapons and placed it into one master weapon blueprint. This way, there was no loss of information or problems communicating from one blueprint to another, and no items were being deleted and created, making changing weapons much simpler. This time around, I also decided to use a line trace system rather than a projectile system. The projectile system was the only method I knew last semester, however now I know how to use line trace, I much prefer it. As with line trace, there are no spawning hundreds of projectiles, each with their own light source, which becomes a performance issue when the player is spawning 40 rounds a second with one of the weapons. So the aesthetic I'm aiming for, as you can see from the trailer, is an insane twin-stick shooter following a crazy pest control employee who likes his job a bit too much. I want the atmosphere to be almost comedic, with the player's characters screaming obscenities at enemies and the feedback from enemies going ragdoll being entertaining. To create this, I went for a kind of I wanted to go for like a juicy colour, with lots of bold colours and lights to emphasise the crazy in my game, with lots of kind of complementary colours as well. A key part of my aesthetic is my light and post-processing effects. Firstly, the level follows a blue kind of colour scheme, with all the lights that are placed above the enemy grates slightly darker blue than others to show players where they are. A large part of my game's aesthetic is done with my post-process effect volume. This volume is responsible for a lot of small but noticeable changes in my level. So for example, before I tell them what they are, this is an example of the level without it, and this is an example of the level with it, and this is them side by side. In order to achieve this look, I firstly used the colour grading and brought both the contrast and gain up a notch. I played around with the saturation, but I disliked it, so I left it at the default value. I then changed around the ambient occlusion settings. I pushed up the intensity and static friction as I wanted the scene to be kind of darker around the corners in order to make the blue colour pop out. So I set the power to 2 in order to darken them down. Finally, I set the quality to max because the textures and models are kind of reduced because of the camera distance. I could afford to have the best quality. I next played with the global illumination. Like I stated earlier, I wanted to have the overall theme of the level to be kind of like a blue steel. So I set the indirect lighting color to be kind of a cyan color and set the intensity about halfway up, as it doesn't have a very, very huge effect, but still a noticeable one. This was all the post-processing I did for the level. However, for the player, they have their own special set of post-processing effects that activate at certain times. Using blueprints, I created a system that upon the player reaching a certain health value, the post-processing effects take over and start to affect the color balance and vision. As they lose more health, the edges of the objects being to split apart into the RGB values that make them up, and then they lose the saturation of the colors around them, save for the red channel, so that they can still identify enemies clearly. For my sound effects, I firstly chose some sound effects for each of my weapons, and using blueprints, cause them to fire at regular intervals whenever I'm shooting, and to alter the pitch as well in between each shot, like I said earlier from my design choices, to make them sound more realistic. The player themselves also has a voice in-game. The voice is from a Psycho in another well-known game, Borderlands 2, and I chose it because I think it fits perfectly my character, since this game is about an insane space pest control maniac who loves his job too much. So I thought it'd be perfect for him to scream obscenities at enemies. The music chosen was tailored along with the voice I chose as well. I wanted some fast-paced music to match the game's fast pace, and to go along with the space genre, I took some kind of heavy techno bass music and put that into the game. Another piece of aesthetic I worked on was the particles in game. In the first semester, some of the particles I had were good, but some needed some kind of tuning up, and others I had in mind but didn't have the knowledge to create. Firstly, the fine-tuning was required was in my centrifuge. The laser in the centrifuge was clipping through the walls in my earlier levels, so in order to fix that, I changed the beam from a distance to a source and target beam, and then set up a line trace on each beam. The target would be wherever the particle was emitted from, and the target would be the first object to collide with the line trace, so now the laser fits seamlessly into the room, and even gives the player the strategy of using the enemies as laser meat, kind of like a laser meat shield of sorts. The biggest particle I desperately wanted to create, though, was the bullet trail particle, and it's another reason why I swapped over to line trace, because I really, really wanted to get this particle in. Similar to the laser beam, it's created using a source target and a special material, masking off the space around the trail, and then it sets its source as the weapon and the target as the first object hit. And at the hit location as well, there's also a kind of bullet explosion particle created using some of the Unreal Engine pre-made assets and materials. These are some of the models in my level. Because of the camera angle and distance from the actual models in game, the poly counts and texture resolution don't need to be that high. Most of my scene items are all under 1000 polys, staying in that kind of 500 to 1000 poly range. There are some exceptions, with them being my main centrifuge for the gravity room and the engine room burners for the engine room. Other than that, though, the models are low poly. There are no high poly was needed to be created for objects and baked down, as the detail was minute and could easily be handled in Quixel. All models follow a guideline. They all have albedo diffuse maps on all map, metalness map, a spec map, and an ambient occlusion map. Some smaller objects don't have spec and metalness maps because of their distance and size relative to the camera angle and player. They would never be seen and so therefore are pointless. Some objects also have glow maps that add to the scene lighting, and some, like the weapon pickups, have panning textures that cause a cloudy moving glow over them. As for materials, most of the materials in my game are standard. Some materials are interesting, such as the materials used in my beam and bullet trail particle. These use opacity masks in order to mask away the areas that need to be hidden, so that the particle can use the material without it being a big square in the middle of the screen.